Thank you. We have the technology. Thank you, Harold. And good morning. Thanks very much for having me here. I'd like to use this opportunity to pick up on Aaron's observations about the changes happening in higher education and perhaps push those a little bit further than the debate tends to be. I think there's a kind of, having sort of watched all this for many years, there's a kind of persistent illusion among the leaders of the higher education establishment that they're in control of the HE system. And they talk and act as though the future shape and working of the system is determined by government policies, acts, regulations, and by institutions. What we think of as the business of higher education is going through some really fundamental changes. And I'm alluding here to any of you who've done sort of business studies to the work of Theodore Levitt and Marketing Myopia back in the 60s. The HE establishment, Vice-Chancellors, ministers, policymakers, sector group leaders, in even sort of the trade press of THE and others, tends very much to see the world through the lens of 20th century university education. And they presume that higher education is synonymous with going to university for full-time academic study on patterns that really haven't changed much for decades. Their discourse is all about how to defend and perpetuate this model, how to make it fairer, better, more affordable, but almost never about how to change it. But outside that inward-looking, introspective community, that tradition of university education, as I'd like to come on to, addresses just one small part of the explosion in knowledge and learning as the basis of economic, social and individual welfare, prosperity, well-being in the world. People and business and polities want much more than universities are offering. As I've said here, universities still think they're in the business of people going to university. The rest of the world is in the business of what I'd like to term purposeful learning to cope in a complex, uncertain, fast-moving world. And when we start to say, well, what does that world look like? As soon as we lift our eyes from that sort of traditional model of HE being about getting school leavers through to having degrees and going into work, and think what we might mean by purposeful learning, we see this incredibly rich and diverse universe of possibilities. Learners fall into many different categories, extending way beyond just the bridge between secondary education and real life and the rest of their lives. There's incommensurately diverse purposes for extending their knowledge and a growing range of choices over these. And this kind of Rubik's Cube view sort of shows, I think, attempts to show those dimensions. And I don't think we need to sort of work too hard to find a new language for this. We can look backwards, really, this kind of mix and match view. And I was looking back at the definitions of higher education in the old national qualifications framework. And I think we can say in this view, higher education is about developing, sharing, acquiring and applying what we have here, highly developed and complex levels of knowledge that enable in-depth and original responses to complex and unpredictable problems and situations. And I think every university will say, yeah, that's just what we do. But when you look at what they're really doing, it's open to challenge. And so when we think, what does this mean in practice? This is, I think, looks rather more like that sort of elephant in children's books than so there's a better picture somewhere. But we can visualize this landscape in terms of these dimensions as a kind of matrix of learner motivations and the choices available. Motivations extend from, as we're saying here, from getting academic awards through professional qualifications, through this huge growing market of just having recognized competence for particular areas and career and working needs. And similarly, sort of modes of study are exploding from learners, sort of going full-time to an educationalist provider, whether it's a university or an alternative institution, through sort of hybrid mixes of work, employer-based and institution-based study, through to an entirely context-based model of learning, whether it's in employment or whether it's in major projects or other areas. And there's a similar growth in the offers available within each of those. And what we got in the slide here is just some of those things, ranging, perhaps the right slip of the tongue there, from traditional degree programs and so on, through degree apprenticeships, which could perhaps be the next big thing. I think we watch and see, through to prior experience and earning credits and these things. And you don't need me to read out the slide, and you'll have it. And I think this illustrates some really quite important points about the nature of this exploding market for purposeful learning. Most obviously, I think it shows that a conventional view of university education is actually addressing just one small part of this marketplace. And this is perhaps where Aaron and I will differ in terms of the data, because what we don't have is any reliable data for the current and potential size of these markets, because none of them are kind of official and established. But I think it is safe to assume that taken together they are much, much bigger than the 2 million or so people studying in universities, and indeed the 20 billion or so that they spend in them. So we're talking serious stuff. And that gives the other observation. There's an awful lot of stuff about private providers, alternative providers, challengers coming into that bottom left-hand market and taking over and sort of stimulating the business of universities. I think when you look at this, as indeed these providers do, whether it's Pearson's or Google or Amazon even, you say, why would they crowd into one small market that is struggling to protect itself when all of the opportunities are elsewhere? And that's where challenges and alternative provision is going to come. So what does this mean for universities? And I'm going to have to canter through, I think, what I've got here. Of course, all universities recognise these changes, and they're working in different ways to engage with them. But for most part, those responses are quite specific and incremental and marginal. They're sort of ad hoc, toe in the water extensions of their current offers, extending their current courses to new markets, or trying to address new markets with things like, degree apprenticeships, online courses, tailored employer courses being like that. But when we stand back and when we look across the world, not just in the UK-centric view of things, I think what we're seeing coming through is what I would term, a really radical new order of 21st century model of universities, which is characterized by these four defining features that I've got on here. And these developments, as each of them challenges quite deeply held shibboleths and assumptions about the very nature of a university. And there'll be plenty in the sector who regard them as almost insulting. But they're real and they're happening and will shape the future, I'm sure. So just very quickly cantering through them, starting with universities are moving towards being market and client-led within this universe of purposeful learning. So the days when the academic community could determine what it is they offer and what people should want from them are under fundamental challenge, especially as there are alternatives available for people. So universities have to compete with a wide range with each other and a wide range of providers to offer a much wider portfolio of learning and knowledge services to different groups, each of whom are determining what they want and what they're going to look for and where they're going to invest their money. And this challenges a lot of assumptions, not least assumptions about academic quality. I mean, in this world, quality is much more fitness for purpose in the views of client groups and paying learners. And within that, the assumptions of academic integrity and reliability and all of those things, they remain important, but they're not the main thing for people who are looking for the benefits and the value they get from their choices. So one big force for change there. These are all interlinked, really. The other is how universities relate to their markets and to the world. And the days of the self-contained autonomous institution, just as the days of the self-contained autonomous firm are really sort of becoming quite anachronistic, are over. And already universities deliver their business, grow their business, go to market in very different ways in every area of their operations. So, in terms of research, every university is doing an awful lot of its research in collaborations and networks. Things like the N8 network and the M5 network and sharing facilities. Internationalization, we're seeing some powerful global alliances coming through, like Warwick with Monash and the new relationship between King's and New South Wales and New York University? Sorry? Arizona State, that's right, thank you. This plus thing. So, and I think these are important changes. In terms of marketing and going to market, global partnerships, for example, between Liverpool and Laureate Group, which controls some 60 plus universities around the world, on recruitment and going to market internationally. People are into study group. Hobson's working with institutions around the sector. You probably know your own other examples of those, but a big change there of how universities go. Big change therefore in what the offer is and how it's designed and how it's determined. This notion of purposeful learning, redefining, reshaping higher education means that instead of saying, we research and we teach and we publish around disciplines and how they apply and put that kind of discipline push view of the world, everyone else is in a solutions-based mode and a problem-solving mode, whether it's individual learners and employers who aren't looking necessarily for people who know stuff, but people who know and can work together to solve complex problems and create innovations. Research funding is rapidly moving away from discipline-based, deeper and deeper research into collaborations to address the societal grand challenges. And you look at things like the UN programs and the Horizon 2020 programs, and indeed what's coming through Innovate UK and the industrial strategy. And that's relating to what business is looking for. Business looking for innovation, open innovation models through collaborations and multiple sourcing, not simply how do we apply and own this technology. And the same, we're seeing the emergence of completely new disciplines and new ways of seeing the world that cut right across things. And this is affecting and challenging the organisation of universities that are having to somehow reconcile structures built around disciplines and discipline groups into these cross-cutting, externally applied things. Then the fourth dimension of this new order, I think, is a much greater focus on universities and place, which isn't just a UK agenda, though I think it's becoming very important here. Most universities in the UK, in Europe, in the States, were originally founded to serve their local communities and their local business and commerce. But over the years, they've kind of lost sight of that aspect of their mission and have positioned themselves against each other, whether as global or international national players. But we're seeing that trend come full circle, I think, as economic and social policies increasingly focus at local levels, at city region levels. And this is coming through as a big issue behind the whole Brexit debate here, and indeed for I suspect, the domestic policies of our next government, whoever they might be. So local engagement in all its practical applications and its thing has moved beyond the social responsibility of universities, which has always been there, into a strategic priority. And progressive universities are increasingly positioning themselves as agents of local growth and community development in these. And that, of course, links to the whole thing of working in networks. It works about purposeful learning and being sort of led by your client communities in what you're doing. So, what happened? So, where does this take us? I think it means we need to really challenge quite fundamentally the assumptions that we're making about the nature of higher education. And, there's a kind of big emerging acknowledgement of these things, but possibly not sufficient debate about just how profound they are. And we do really need some articulation, debate and challenge about new visions of what we mean by the business of higher education in today's world and its relevance to the world. And I think there's not a great deal even of sort of literature and speculation on this. The one thing I would commend, though, is MIT's report on the future of MIT education, which is there on their website, which I think is one of the most accessible and interesting articulations for them of these kinds of trends there. So where this takes us, I think universities need to redefine themselves, not in terms of where they stand against each other or what their standing is in the world, but what their benefits are and their services to society in all of its manifestations. It implies a big turnaround in funding and business models, financial models and policies geared to lifetime learning across that whole landscape, and not simply this obsession with the cohort of young people and who then go on to their following 40 years and find what they need elsewhere. It's got big implications for the business and operating models of universities. It challenges almost everything, and hence, therefore, the leadership and capabilities that they need. And there's a whole further debate about those things, but I think, having probably pushed my time to the limit, that's the sort of proposition I'd like to sort of feed into today's debate. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. We'll take questions collectively at the end, although the one that's screaming out for me, of course, is